The British royal family had seen many storms over the years, but the storm that gathered in late 2025 and early 2026 was unlike anything anyone had expected. It started quietly, the way most palace crises do, with whispers behind closed doors and nervous glances exchanged between advisors who knew that something big was coming. King Charles III, the man who had waited longer than any heir in British history to sit on the throne, was now facing the very real possibility that his reign might be remembered not for what he built, but for what fell apart around him. Charles had been battling cancer, a diagnosis that Buckingham Palace revealed in early 2024. BTS times the treatments had been grueling. There were weeks when the king barely had the energy to walk through the palace halls, let alone carry out the demanding schedule of a reigning monarch. His doctors told him to rest. His wife, Queen Camilla, insisted he stay in bed more often. But Charles was a man of duty. He had spent his entire life preparing for this role, and he was not about to let illness take it away from him without a fight. Yet the illness was only one part of the problem. The bigger crisis, the one that kept palace officials awake at night, was the scandal surrounding his younger brother, Prince Andrew. Andrew had been arrested on suspicion of misconduct in public office over his long-standing links to the convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein, making him the first British royal in more than 350 years to be taken into police custody. Al Jazeera, the news, had sent shockwaves through the country. People who had once respected the monarchy were now openly questioning whether the institution deserved their loyalty. Charles had tried to handle the Andrew situation decisively. He had stripped Andrew of his royal titles and effectively banished him from the royal fold. The royal observer, but it was not enough. The public wanted more. They wanted accountability, transparency, and proof that the palace was not protecting one of its own. Polls showed something alarming. For the first time in the United Kingdom, the monarchy's approval ratings had slipped below 50%, a symbolic threshold that did not go unnoticed behind palace walls. The royal observer inside the palace, the mood was tense. Staff members moved carefully, speaking in hushed tones. Everyone could feel that something was shifting. The old order, the one that Charles had worked so hard to establish when he finally became king, was beginning to crack. And standing at the center of this shift, watching everything unfold with sharp eyes and growing determination, was Prince William. The Prince of Wales had always been seen as the future of the monarchy, but now, it seemed, the future was arriving much sooner than anyone had planned. William had been frustrated for years. He had watched his uncle Andrew drag the family name through the mud, and he had repeatedly urged senior royals to take stronger action. According to royal author Russell Myers, William had pushed for firmer steps against Andrew as far back as 2019. Following Andrew's disastrous television interview about his relationship with Epstein, Yahoo! William believed that the longer the family waited, the more damage would be done. He had been right, but nobody had listened soon enough now. With his father's health declining and the Andrew scandal growing worse by the day, William found himself stepping into a role that he had not expected to fill so soon. He began attending more meetings, making more decisions, and carrying more of the weight of the monarchy on his shoulders. The transition was not official, but everyone could see it happening. The son was slowly taking over from the father, not out of ambition, but out of necessity. And then there was Camilla. The Queen Consort had always been a controversial figure. Many people in Britain had never fully accepted her, remembering the pain she had caused during her affair with Charles while he was still married to Princess Diana. But Camilla had worked hard to rebuild her image over the years, and for a while it seemed like she had succeeded. Now, however, new tensions were rising, and they involved not just the public, but the very family she had married into. Reports emerged that William had issued Camilla an ultimatum regarding her close friendship with Sarah Ferguson, Andrew's former wife, who had appeared frequently in the newly released Epstein-related files. Reality T. Williams' position was simple and uncompromising. He believed that anyone connected to the Epstein scandal, even through association, needed to be kept at a distance from the royal family. There could be no exceptions, no gray areas, and no room for sentimentality. The institution had to come first. This stance put William directly at odds with Camilla. Sources close to the palace said that William had massively overstepped the mark, in some people's eyes, by criticizing Camilla so directly. Reality, after all, Charles was still the king, and constitutionally, the authority rested with him. But William was not backing down. He saw himself as the protector of the monarchy's future, and he was willing to ruffle feathers to ensure that future was secure. The British public watched all of this unfold through newspaper headlines and television reports, and opinions were divided. Some people admired William's decisive nature and saw him as exactly the kind of leader the country needed. Others worried that he was moving too fast, too aggressively, and that his actions might cause more division within the family at a time, when unity was desperately needed. What nobody could deny, however, was that the balance of power within the royal family was changing. The old guard was weakening, and a new generation was rising. Whether this would save the monarchy or push it further into crisis remained to be seen. But one thing was certain. The story of King Charles, Prince William, and Queen Camilla was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning, and every chapter that followed would be more dramatic than the last. As the weeks passed, the tension inside Buckingham Palace grew thicker. The walls of the ancient building had witnessed centuries of royal drama. But even by those historic standards, the early months of 2026 were extraordinary. King Charles was growing weaker. His cancer treatments had been scaled back at his own insistence. But the toll they had taken on his body was visible to everyone around him. He moved more slowly. He tired more easily. And the spark of determination that had always burned in his eyes was beginning to dim. Camilla, according to palace insiders, had become increasingly controlling of Charles during this period. She reportedly insisted that he stay in his room and rest, and would become upset if he tried to assert his independence. Globe magazine, her official explanation was that she was looking after his health, doing what any loving wife would do for a sick husband. But not everyone in the palace believed that this was the whole story. Some staff members whispered that Camilla was using Charles's illness as an opportunity to expand her own influence within the household. Sources described Camilla as someone who would move through the palace issuing orders, confronting anyone who did not follow her instructions, and generally creating an atmosphere of unease. Globe magazine, the staff, many of whom had served the royal family for decades, were not accustomed to this kind of behavior from a queen consort. They had known Queen Elizabeth II, a woman of quiet grace and steady composure. Camilla's approach was very different, and it was causing problems. Meanwhile, William was becoming more visible in his new role. He and Princess Kate had begun meeting with senior government officials, attending briefings on matters of national importance, and representing the crown at events that would traditionally have been handled by the king himself. It was not a formal handover of power. There had been no official announcement, no constitutional process set in motion. But in practice, William was doing much of the work that his father could no longer manage. Reports surfaced that palace courtiers were beginning to speak more openly about the possibility of a formal transition. A senior courtier was quoted as saying that plans for such a shift were no longer purely speculative, and that conversations about timing were becoming more concrete. Yahoo! The idea was not that Charles would abdicate in the traditional sense. British monarchs do not simply hand over the crown. But there were ways, constitutional and practical, to gradually transfer responsibilities so that the country would barely notice the difference. William approached this transition with a seriousness that impressed even his critics. He understood that the monarchy was at a crossroads. The Andrew scandal had damaged public trust in a way that went beyond one person's disgrace. It had raised fundamental questions about whether the royal family was accountable to the same rules as everyone else. William knew that if the monarchy was going to survive, it needed to demonstrate that it was willing to change, to modernize, and to hold itself to higher standards. One of his first major moves was to establish a clear boundary between the crown and anyone connected to the Epstein scandal. This meant not only Andrew, but also those who maintained close ties to Andrew and his former wife Sarah Ferguson. William's position was that total separation was the only responsible strategy, and he saw drawing a hard line as the safest way to protect the institution from further harm. Reality This approach brought him into direct conflict with Camilla once again. The Queen Consort had maintained a friendship with Sarah Ferguson for years. She did not appreciate being told who she could and could not associate with, especially by her stepson. The friction between them reportedly caused tension with King Charles as well. Since some in the palace felt that William was acting as though the crown was already his, even though it formally was not, reality TK played a crucial role during this period. She served as a calming presence beside William, helping him navigate the complex web of family relationships and palace politics. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, that the way William handled this transition would define not just his future reign, but the future of the monarchy itself. Kate encouraged William to be firm but fair, to stand his ground on matters of principle while being respectful of his father's position and feelings. The couple also had their children to think about. Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis were growing up in the middle of this upheaval, and both William and Kate were determined to protect them from the worst of it. Yahoo! Kate was especially focused on ensuring that her children would grow up in a healthier environment than the one that had shaped previous generations of royals. She had seen what the pressures of royal life had done to people like Princess Diana, Prince Harry, and even Andrew himself, and she was resolved that her children would have a different experience. As the public watched the situation unfold, a fascinating dynamic emerged. People began to see William and Kate not just as the future of the monarchy, but as its present. The couple's popularity was rising steadily, while support for Charles and Camilla was declining. Newspapers that had once been friendly to the king were now running stories about the need for a generational shift. Television commentators discussed whether Charles's reign might be the shortest in modern British history. Inside the palace, Charles was aware of all of this, and it hurt. He had spent his entire life preparing to be king, and now the world seemed to be telling him that his time was already over. He loved his son and was proud of the man William had become. But there was a part of him, a deeply human part, that struggled with the idea of stepping aside. He was not ready to give up. Not yet. Camilla, sensing the shifting tides, began to position herself more carefully. She understood that her influence depended on Charles remaining on the throne, and she was determined to hold on to whatever power she could for as long as possible. This made her relationship with William even more complicated, because every move she made to support Charles's continued reign was seen by William as an obstacle to the necessary transition. The palace had become a chessboard, and every member of the royal family was a piece being moved by forces both within and beyond their control. The question was no longer whether change would come. It was how it would come and who would be standing when the dust finally settled. The answer to that question would shape the British monarchy for generations to come. The spring of 2026 brought no relief for the British royal family. If anything, the pressure intensified. The media, which had been circling the palace like hawks for months, now sensed blood. Every day brought a new headline, a new rumor, a new anonymous source claiming to know what was really happening behind the grand doors of Buckingham Palace. And at the heart of every story were the same three names: Charles, William, and Camilla. The Camilla situation had taken on a life of its own. What had started as quiet rumors about tension between the Queen, the consort, and the Prince of Wales had escalated into a full-blown public narrative. Sources close to the palace confirmed that Camilla was becoming less involved in major decisions as William and Kate's influence grew, and that the couple did not want her involved in big-picture strategy. Yahoo! This was not just palace gossip. It represented a real and significant shift in how power was being distributed within the royal household. The relationship between Camilla and William had never been warm. William had never fully forgiven Camilla for her role in the breakdown of his parents' marriage. The affair between Charles and Camilla during his marriage to Princess Diana had caused immense pain. And while William had learned to be civil with his stepmother over the years, genuine affection had never developed between them. Yahoo! Now, with William stepping into a more prominent leadership role, the old wounds were being reopened. Camilla found herself increasingly isolated within the palace. The staff, who took their cues from whoever held the most power, were beginning to orient themselves toward William and Kate. The courtiers who had once been loyal to Camilla were quietly shifting their allegiance. It was the kind of slow, silent revolution that palaces are famous for, where no one announces the change, everyone feels it. Reports also emerged about Camilla's efforts to prevent King Charles from reconciling with Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. According to insiders, Camilla was actively working to ensure that the couple would not be welcomed back into the royal fold. Globo magazine, she saw Harry and Meghan as threats, people who had already caused enormous damage to the family's reputation through their public interviews and their Netflix projects. Camilla believed that allowing them back would only create more problems, but this position put her at odds with Charles, who still harbored a deep desire to heal his relationship with his younger son. Charles was a father, and despite everything that had happened, the thought of being permanently estranged from Harry caused him genuine pain. He had been making quiet efforts to reach out to Harry, and there were reports of private conversations between father and son that gave some hope for reconciliation. William's position on Harry was complicated. He had his own grievances against his brother, stemming from Harry's tell-all memoir and the couple's public criticisms of the royal family. But William was also pragmatic. He understood that a divided royal family was a weakened royal family, and he was open to the idea of some form of reconciliation. As long as it was done on terms that protected the institution, the Andrew scandal continued to cast its shadow over everything. The emotional toll of the situation on King Charles was significant, particularly as he continued to deal with his own health challenges. The Royal Observer, every new revelation about Andrew's connections to Epstein, every new file that was released, every new media report brought fresh embarrassment and pain. Charles had done what he could by stripping Andrew of his titles and removing him from royal life. But the stain would not wash away. Branding experts pointed out that no matter what the royal family did, Andrew's direct association with the Epstein scandal would always follow them. The best strategy, they argued, was to build the royal brand around its strongest assets, which meant William and Kate. Geo.tv, this was advice that Charles found difficult to hear, because it essentially meant admitting that his own brand, his own reign, was no longer strong enough to carry the monarchy forward. The British public, meanwhile, was growing impatient. They wanted clarity. They wanted to know who was in charge, what was happening with the monarchy, and whether the institution they had supported for centuries was still worthy of their support. The uncertainty was corrosive. It eroded trust, fueled speculation, and made every small incident seem like evidence of a larger crisis. William tried to address this uncertainty by being as visible and as active as possible. He and Kate attended events across the country, meeting ordinary people, listening to their concerns, and showing that the monarchy was still relevant and connected to the lives of everyday citizens. These appearances were carefully planned, and they were effective. People responded warmly to the couple. They saw in William and Kate a freshness and a sincerity that had been missing from royal public life for some time. Kate, in particular, drew enormous praise for her grace under pressure. She had faced her own health challenges in 2024, and her recovery and return to public life had been widely admired. Now, standing beside William as the monarchy navigated its most difficult period in decades, she projected a calm confidence that reassured the nation. She understood that people were watching not just what the royals did, but how they did it, and she was determined to set the right tone. Behind the scenes, however, the family dynamics remained fraught. Camilla felt cornered and was lashing out in ways that made the situation worse. Sources described her as becoming more aggressive in her behavior within the palace, particularly when she had been drinking, which was reportedly happening more frequently. Global magazine, this created an uncomfortable environment for everyone in the household. From senior courtiers to junior staff members, Charles was caught in the middle. Torn between loyalty to his wife and recognition that his son was doing what needed to be done, he loved Camilla. She had been his companion through the most difficult periods of his life, and he owed her a great deal. But he also loved the monarchy, and he could see that the institution needed what William was offering, which was youth, energy, decisiveness, and a willingness to make hard choices. The king began to have private conversations with his most trusted advisors about what a transition might look like. These were not conversations about abdication. Charles was not prepared to use that word. but they were conversations about how responsibilities could be shared, how duties could be redistributed, and how the monarchy could present a united front to the world. Even as its internal dynamics were undergoing a profound transformation, the pieces were moving, and the outcome was becoming clearer with each passing day. By the middle of 2026, the situation had reached a point where even the most optimistic palace insiders acknowledged that a major change was inevitable. King Charles had been a monarch for less than 4 years, but his reign already felt like it belonged to a different era. The world had moved on, the public's expectations had shifted, and the scandals that had dogged the royal family had left. Scars that no amount of tradition or ceremony could hide. Speculation about a formal transition of power from Charles to William had intensified dramatically. Reports claimed that unnamed palace sources were discussing the possibility of Charles handing over key responsibilities within months, with his health being cited as the most practical and publicly acceptable explanation. BTS Times the palace had not confirmed any of these reports, and officially, business continued as usual. But behind the scenes, preparations were quietly being made. William and Kate had privately committed to doing things differently when their time came. They had vowed to scale back significantly on the extravagance that had characterized Charles's coronation in 2023, which had cost the British government nearly £100 million and had drawn widespread criticism during a cost of living crisis. Yahoo! William understood that in a country where ordinary families were struggling to pay their grocery and energy bills, the monarchy could not afford to appear wasteful or out of touch. This commitment to a more modest approach extended beyond finances. William and Kate envisioned a monarchy that was more accessible, more transparent, and more connected to the realities of modern British life. They wanted to retain the tradition and pageantry that made the monarchy unique, but they also wanted to strip away the excess and the secrecy that had caused so many problems in the past. Camilla, sensing that her time in the spotlight was drawing to a close, made a series of moves that only deepened the divisions within the family. According to sources, she was deeply concerned about where she would stand once William eventually took the throne, knowing that his feelings toward her had never been warm. Globe magazine, she began making arrangements for her own future, including thinking about where she would live and what role, if any, she would play in public life. Reports indicated that Camilla would likely choose to retire to Ray Mill House in Wiltshire, the estate she had acquired through her divorce from her first husband, Andrew Parker Bowles, in 1995. Global magazine, it was a beautiful property, and it represented a kind of independence that Camilla had always valued. But it was also a far cry from the grandeur of Buckingham Palace, and the prospect of moving there felt like a demotion, a quiet admission that her time as queen consort was coming to an end. The public's reaction to all of this was mixed, but increasingly favorable toward William. Surveys showed that a majority of British citizens supported the idea of a younger monarch, who could bring fresh energy and new ideas to the role. William's decisive handling of the Andrew crisis, his willingness to make unpopular decisions, and his commitment to modernizing the monarchy had earned him respect across the political spectrum. Kate's role in this shift could not be overstated. She had become the emotional heart of the new royal order, the person who reminded the public that behind the titles and the ceremonies were real human beings with real feelings and real concerns. Her work with charities, her focus on children's mental health, and her own personal resilience had made her one of the most admired women in the world. Together, she and William presented an image of a couple who were ready to lead, not because they craved power, but because they understood the responsibility that came with it. Kate was especially passionate about ensuring that her 3 children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, would grow up as well-rounded, independent individuals, regardless of the extraordinary circumstances of their birth. Yahoo! She had studied the mistakes of previous royal generations, where second and third children were often marginalized or left to struggle without purpose. Kate wanted all 3 of her children to have meaningful lives. Whether or not they ever sat on the throne, Charles, for his part, had begun to make peace with the idea that his legacy might be different from what he had imagined. He had always dreamed of being a reforming king. A monarch who championed environmental causes, supported the arts, and brought the Commonwealth closer together. Some of these dreams had been realized. His environmental advocacy had been widely praised, and his dedication to public service was beyond question. But the scandals, the illness, and the relentless pace of change had made it impossible for him to fulfill all of his ambitions. In his quieter moments, Charles took comfort in the knowledge that William was ready. His son had grown into a man of strength and conviction, someone who could carry the weight of the crown with dignity and purpose. Charles had not always agreed with William's methods, particularly his harsh treatment of Camilla and his uncompromising stance on the Andrew situation, but he respected his son's judgment and trusted that William would do what was best for the monarchy. The relationship between father and son during this period was complex, but ultimately loving. They spoke regularly, sometimes about matters of state and sometimes about ordinary family things. Charles gave William advice based on his decades of experience, and William listened, even when he disagreed. There was a mutual understanding between them that transcended the politics and the drama. They were both committed to the same goal, which was ensuring that the British monarchy would endure for future generations. As summer approached, the palace began making subtle but noticeable changes. William was given access to more briefings, more documents, and more decision-making authority. His meetings with government ministers became more frequent. His public engagements took on a more regal tone. The transition was happening in slow motion, carefully managed to avoid any sudden shocks that might destabilize. Public confidence, the media covered every development with intense interest, and the British public followed along with a mixture of fascination and concern. This was history unfolding in real time, and everyone knew it. The monarchy was changing, and the change was being driven not by revolution or crisis alone, but by a family trying to find its way through one of the most challenging periods in its long and storied history. The story of King Charles, Prince William, and Queen Camilla was not just a story about power. It was a story about family, about loyalty, about the weight of tradition, and about the courage it takes to change. Every person involved in this drama was human, flawed and trying to do what they believed was right. Even when those beliefs brought them into conflict with the people they loved, King Charles had spent his entire life waiting for the crown. He had endured decades of scrutiny, criticism, and doubt. When he finally became king, he approached the role with sincerity and dedication, but life had other plans. His cancer diagnosis shook him physically, and the Andrew scandal shook the institution he had sworn to protect. These were not challenges that any amount of preparation could have anticipated. And Charles deserved sympathy for the way he had tried to navigate them. His greatest achievement during this turbulent period may have been his willingness to let go. Not all at once, and not without pain, but gradually and with grace. Charles understood that the monarchy was bigger than any one person, and that its survival depended on its ability to adapt. By allowing William to take on more responsibility, by stepping back when his body and the circumstances demanded it, Charles showed a kind of strength that was often overlooked in the dramatic headlines. Camilla's story was perhaps the most tragic of all. She had spent years rebuilding her reputation after the scandal of her affair with Charles. She had worked hard, attended countless engagements, supported numerous charities, and tried to be a good queen consort. But the public's memory was long, and the wounds she had caused were deep. No matter how many good deeds she performed, there would always be people who saw her as the woman who had destroyed Princess Diana's marriage. Now, as the power shifted toward William and Kate, Camilla found herself facing a future that was uncertain and, in many ways, diminished. The palace that had been her home was becoming a place where she was increasingly marginalized. The husband she had loved and supported was growing weaker, and the stepson, who would one day be king, had made it clear that he did not want her involved in the decisions that would shape the monarchy's future. It was a lonely position, and it evoked a complicated kind of sympathy. Camilla had made mistakes, but she had also made sacrifices. She had stood by Charles through his cancer treatment, through the Andrew crisis, and through countless other challenges. Whatever her flaws, her commitment to Charles as a person, as a husband, was genuine. William and Kate. meanwhile, stood on the threshold of a new era. They had not asked for this responsibility to arrive so soon, but they had accepted it with the determination and seriousness that the moment demanded. William's approach to leadership was different from his father's, where Charles was cautious and diplomatic. William was direct and decisive. Where Charles sought consensus, William was willing to make unilateral decisions if he believed they were necessary. This difference in style had caused friction within the family, but it was also exactly what the monarchy needed at this particular moment in history. The institution was facing threats on multiple fronts: declining public approval, ongoing scandals, a changing media landscape, and a younger generation of citizens who questioned whether the monarchy was still relevant. These challenges required bold leadership, and William was prepared to provide it. Kate was his equal partner in every sense. She brought emotional intelligence, public warmth, a deep understanding of what ordinary people needed from their royal family. She had transformed from a shy university student into one of the most poised and capable public figures in the world. And her journey had resonated with millions of people, who saw in her a reflection of their own struggles and triumphs. Together, William and Kate represented a vision of monarchy that was both traditional and modern. They respected the history and the ceremony that gave the institution its unique character. But they also understood that respect alone was not enough. The monarchy had to earn the public's trust every single day through actions, through transparency, and through a genuine commitment to serving the people. The transfer of power from Charles to William was not a single event, but a process, one that unfolded over months and would continue to evolve in the years to come. There would be a formal coronation at some point. Reports suggested it would be far more modest than the grand ceremony that had marked Charles's accession. Yahoo! William and Kate wanted their coronation to reflect the values they intended to bring to their reign: simplicity, sincerity, and a connection to the people they served. As for the future, nobody could predict exactly how events would unfold. The British monarchy had survived wars, revolutions, abdications, and scandals over its 1,000-year history. It had endured because it had always found a way to adapt, to evolve, and to remain relevant to the people it served. Now, with a new generation stepping forward, the monarchy was once again being tested. The story that had begun with a sick king, a controversial queen, and an ambitious prince was far from over. New chapters would be written, new challenges would arise, and new decisions would need to be made. But the foundation had been laid. William and Kate had shown that they were ready. The British public had shown that they were willing to give the couple a chance. In the end, that was all any monarch could ask for: the opportunity to serve and the trust of the people they served. The crown would endure, not because it was perfect, but because the people who wore it were willing to fight for its future, one day at a time.